Somewhere above the frozen cloud deck over Germany in the winter of 1943, a young American fighter pilot pushed his throttles forward to close on a formation of enemy bombers, and in that instant, his engines began to die, not from enemy fire, not from flak, but from the machine itself betraying him at 30,000 feet. Spark plugs fouling, superchargers surging, oil congealing in lines, never designed for such punishing cold. And as his aircraft shuddered and lost power, the same twin-boom silhouette that Lockheed's engineers had once called the future of American air power became, for a terrifying season, a coffin with wings. This is the story of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, an airplane so radical, so far ahead of its time, that it nearly failed before it ever had the chance to succeed, and the story of the obsessive, unglamorous engineering fix, a redesigned turbo-regulator and a new intercooler system that rescued it from disaster in the skies over Europe and transformed it into one of the deadliest fighters of the Pacific War, the aircraft that would carry America's two highest-scoring aces of all time to their legendary kill counts, and the aircraft that, on an April morning in 1943, would fly one of the most audacious interception missions in the history of aerial warfare to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor himself. But before any of that glory, there was failure, cold, mechanical, humiliating failure. And to understand how the Lightning became a legend, you first have to understand how close it came to becoming a footnote. When Lockheed's design team, led by the brilliant and unconventional Hall Hibbard, alongside a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, sat down in 1937 to answer a U.S. Army Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of speeds over 360 miles per hour. They did not produce anything resembling a conventional fighter. Instead, they designed an aircraft built around twin Allison V-1710 engines, each mounted in its own slender boom, with the pilot seated in a central nacelle and the tail connected by twin booms rather than a single fuselage, a configuration so unusual that when it first appeared, veteran aviators didn't know what to call it. Some said it looked like a flying catamaran. Others said it looked like nothing that had ever flown before. And in many ways they were right, because the P-38 was not simply a fighter. It was a flying laboratory for nearly every advanced aviation technology of its era. Tricycle landing gear, when most fighters still used tail wheels, counter-rotating propellers to cancel out torque effects, and most critically, turbo-supercharged engines, a technology that allowed the aircraft to maintain full power at altitudes where ordinary piston engines gasped for oxygen and died. Turbo-superchargers worked by using exhaust gases to spin a turbine that forced compressed air into the engine, and in theory, this meant a P-38 could climb to 30,000 feet and still perform like it was flying at sea level, a genuinely revolutionary capability in 1939. But between theory and combat reality lay an ocean of engineering problems that nobody had yet solved, and those problems would very nearly kill the entire program before Lockheed even got the chance to prove what the Lightning could do. The early flight tests were spectacular. In September 1938, a prototype YP-38 flown by Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey set a transcontinental speed record, flying from California to New York in under 7 hours, and newspapers across the country ran headlines celebrating this strange twin-engine marvel as proof of American aviation supremacy. But records set in ideal conditions by test pilots pushing a single prototype told nothing about how hundreds of production aircraft flown by young men with a few hundred hours of flight time would perform in the brutal cold of European high-altitude combat. And it was there, in the frigid air over the English Channel and the industrial heartland of Germany, that the Lightning's flaws became lethal. The problems arrived in layers, each one compounding the last. First, there was the matter of compressibility, a phenomenon barely understood by aerodynamicists of the era. When a P-38 dove at high speed toward the Earth, chasing an enemy aircraft, the air flowing over its wings in certain sections would approach the speed of sound, even though the aircraft itself was flying well below it. This localized supersonic airflow created shock waves that disrupted lift, and pilots who pushed their Lightnings into steep dives above roughly Mach 0.68 found themselves fighting a control column that had gone rigid, the nose of the aircraft tucking downward uncontrollably, unresponsive to any input, and several pilots died in these compressibility dives, their aircraft simply refusing to pull out before impact. And for months, Lockheed engineers had no definitive explanation for why this was happening, because wind tunnels of the period could not accurately model transonic airflow. This alone would have been enough to cripple confidence in the aircraft, but layered on top of it was an entirely separate and in some ways more insidious problem. The engines themselves were failing, not occasionally but routinely. In the skies over England, the Allison V1710 engines that powered the Lightning were plagued by issues that never appeared during testing in the milder climate of Southern California, where Lockheed's engineers had done their development work at the extreme cold of European high-altitude missions, often 30 or 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The engine oil thickened and lost lubricating properties. The intercoolers, which were built into the leading edges of the wings themselves in early models, a clever space-saving design that ran compressed air from the turbo-supercharger through long tubes inside the wing before feeding it to the engine, could not adequately regulate temperature under these conditions. When the intake air was supercooled by the ambient cold at altitude, the fuel air mixture became so cold and dense that it disrupted combustion, causing engines to run rough, misfire, and sometimes fail outright. And to make matters worse, the turbo-regulators, the automated systems meant to control how much boost the turbo-superchargers delivered, were unreliable and prone to erratic behavior, surging unpredictably, overboosting one moment and starving the engine of pressure the next. And pilots flying escort missions deep into German airspace, hours from home, found themselves suddenly losing power in one or both engines. Sometimes both engines quit simultaneously if the pilot pushed the throttles too aggressively at altitude in the cold, and there are documented accounts of entire formations of Lightnings turning back from missions over the Reich because engines across multiple aircraft were failing in the punishing high-altitude cold, not from a single enemy bullet being fired. General Jimmy Doolittle, who commanded the 8th Air Force in England during this period and who had flown P-38s himself, became one of the aircraft's most vocal critics, not because he doubted its potential, but because he had seen firsthand how the European theater was breaking it. Pilots grew to distrust an airplane that might quit on them at the worst possible moment. Morale suffered, and the statistics from this period painted a grim picture. Loss rates from mechanical failure in the P-38 units flying from England were disproportionately high, and confidence in the aircraft eroded to the point that by mid-1944, 8th Air Force leadership made the decision to withdraw the Lightning from daylight bomber escort duty over Europe entirely, replacing it with the North American P-51 Mustang, whose Rolls-Royce-derived Merlin engine, tuned by Packard, and simpler single-engine design proved far more reliable in the same brutal conditions. And for the P-38, this withdrawal from the premier theater of the air war felt, to many of the men who had flown it and believed in it, like a death sentence for the entire program. The airplane, that was supposed to be America's answer to German air superiority, had instead become a cautionary tale about pushing technology faster than engineering could reliably support it. But here is where the story pivots, because the very engineers who had built the Lightning's flaws had also spent years quietly, methodically chasing their causes. And the truth is that the fixes that would ultimately redeem the P-38 had actually begun before the aircraft was ever pulled from Europe. They simply hadn't been implemented widely enough or early enough to save its reputation in that theater. Lockheed's engineering team, still led by Kelly Johnson, who would go on to found the legendary Skunk Works and design the U-2 and SR-71, had been working obsessively on solving both the compressibility problem and the engine reliability crisis since the earliest reports of trouble reached Burbank. On the compressibility issue, Lockheed engineers eventually developed what they called dive recovery flaps, small hydraulically actuated flaps mounted under the wings that could be extended during a high-speed dive to alter the airflow pattern and prevent the onset of the uncontrollable nose-down tuck. This single addition, deceptively simple in appearance, gave pilots a way to survive dives that had previously killed experienced men, and it was introduced on the P-38J model beginning in 1944, but it was the parallel fix to the engine and cooling system that mattered even more for the aircraft's long-term legacy, because Lockheed's engineers had identified that the fundamental flaw was not the turbo-supercharger concept itself, which remained sound, but the way the compressed air was being cooled and regulated before it reached the engine. The old wing leading-edge intercooler design simply could not maintain consistent, reliable temperatures across the wide range of altitudes and climates the aircraft was being asked to operate in. So, Lockheed redesigned the entire induction system, introducing core-type intercoolers mounted in the wing's leading edge with far greater surface area and more precise thermal regulation, paired with an improved turbo-regulator system that could respond more accurately and consistently to changes in altitude and throttle demand, preventing the wild boost surges that had been starving or overpressurizing the engines. This new configuration first appeared on the P-38G-15 production block, and the difference it made was not incremental, it was transformative. Engines that had once failed routinely in cold, high-altitude conditions now ran smoothly and reliably. Pilots could push their throttles with confidence instead of nursing their engines and praying, and the aircraft that had been withdrawn from Europe in disgrace found itself almost simultaneously becoming something close to invincible in another theater entirely, the vast, brutal, distance-punishing expanse of the Pacific. The Pacific theater demanded something different from a fighter than the European skies did. Missions here were less about dense formations of heavy bombers surrounded by hundreds of enemy fighters in cold stratospheric air, and more about vast oceanic distances, isolated island airstrips, and Japanese aircraft that, while extraordinarily maneuverable, particularly the famous Mitsubishi Zero, were generally lighter, less heavily armed, and less well protected than their German counterparts. And it was in this environment that the Lightning's core strengths, the very same twin-engine redundancy that had caused so much trouble when both engines failed simultaneously in Europe, now became a life-saving asset, because in the Pacific, if one engine did have trouble, and with the improved intercoolers and turbo-regulators, this was now a rare event rather than a common one. A Lightning pilot could often still limp home on the other engine across hundreds of miles of open ocean, something a pilot in a single-engine fighter simply could not do. And the range that came from the aircraft's large fuel capacity, further extended with external drop tanks, meant P-38s could escort bombers or fly fighter sweeps across distances that no German theater fighter needed to cover. And it was this exact capability, long-range flight deep over hostile territory, that set the stage for one of the most famous missions of the entire Pacific War. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted a Japanese message revealing the travel itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was scheduled to make an inspection tour by air near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, and American commanders, after considerable debate about the risks of revealing that their code-breaking capabilities had penetrated Japanese communications, authorized a mission to intercept and shoot down his aircraft. The distance involved over 400 miles each way, flown low over open ocean to avoid radar detection, was simply beyond the range of nearly every other American fighter in the theater, but a squadron of P-38 Lightnings fitted with extra fuel tanks could make the journey. And on the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38s took off from Guadalcanal on a mission requiring almost superhuman precision navigation, flying for nearly 2 hours at wave-top altitude with no landmarks, timed to intercept Yamamoto's transport bombers at a precise point along their route. And, remarkably, the mission succeeded. The American fighters arrived at almost the exact moment Yamamoto's aircraft did. And in the brief, violent engagement that followed, Lightning pilots shot down both Japanese bombers, one carrying Yamamoto himself, who died in the subsequent crash, delivering a devastating blow to Japanese military leadership and naval strategy at a critical juncture in the war. And this mission alone, executed by an aircraft that had been effectively rejected from the skies over Europe, demonstrated exactly what the improved Lightning could do when given a theater and a mission that played to its redesigned strengths. But Yamamoto's death, however historically significant, was only the beginning of the Lightning's Pacific legacy, because it was in the vast air battles over New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and later the Philippines that the P-38 truly earned its reputation as an ace-maker, a machine capable of producing more legendary fighter pilots than almost any other aircraft America put into the sky. Major Richard Bong, a quiet, almost shy young man from Wisconsin who had learned to fly on his family's farm, would become America's highest-scoring ace of the entire war, flying the Lightning, ultimately credited with 40 confirmed aerial victories, a record that stands unmatched by any other American pilot in history. And Bong's success was not simply a product of raw talent. Though he possessed considerable skill, it was also a direct product of the aircraft finally working as intended. Because with reliable engines and improved high-altitude performance, pilots like Bong could execute the tactics the P-38 was always meant to use, diving from altitude with tremendous speed and firepower, concentrated in a nose-mounted battery of 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead in a tight, deadly convergence rather than the wing-mounted angled guns of most fighters, striking hard and fast before climbing back to altitude to set up another attack, a hit-and-run style perfectly suited to an aircraft with speed and climate advantages but somewhat reduced low-speed maneuverability compared to nimbler Japanese fighters. And close behind Bong in the record books was Major Thomas McGuire, an aggressive, fiercely competitive pilot who would finish the war with 38 confirmed victories, making him and Bong the two highest-scoring American aces in history, both flying the same aircraft that had once been considered a liability over European skies. And McGuire's story would end in tragedy in January 1945, when he was killed in the Philippines attempting a tight, low-speed turn to help a squadron mate, a maneuver that pushed his Lightning past its safe handling limits, a stark reminder that even a redeemed and reliable aircraft still demanded respect and discipline from the men who flew it. But the achievements of these two men, and dozens of other Lightning aces who racked up impressive scores across the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, stood as living proof that the aircraft's fundamental design had always been sound, that the failures over Europe had been failures of specific engineering details, cooling and regulation systems poorly matched to extreme cold weather operation, not failures of the underlying concept of a twin-engine, turbo-supercharged, long-range interceptor. And it's worth noting that even in the Mediterranean theater, where conditions differed from both the freezing skies over Germany and the tropical Pacific, improved Lightnings performed admirably, further reinforcing that the aircraft's earlier European struggles had been tied specifically to that theater's uniquely punishing combination of extreme altitude and extreme cold rather than any universal flaw, and by the war's final years, the P-38 in its L model configuration incorporating all the lessons learned from years of hard combat experience, dive recovery flaps to tame compressibility, redesigned intercoolers and turbo-regulators to tame the engines had become one of the most produced and most versatile American combat aircraft of the entire war, serving not only as a fighter, but as a devastatingly effective ground attack platform, a long-range photo reconnaissance aircraft in a stripped-down, unarmed variant that flew some of the most valuable intelligence-gathering missions of the war, and a night fighter variant equipped with radar, and Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who served as a civilian technical consultant in the Pacific, despite his complicated and controversial pre-war political history, worked directly with Lightning pilots to develop improved cruise control engine management techniques that extended the aircraft's already impressive range even further, allowing missions that had seemed impossible just a year or two earlier. And by the time production ended in 1945, over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings had been built, a testament to just how thoroughly the aircraft had redeemed itself from its dark early reputation. What makes the story of the Lightning's turbo and intercooler fix so compelling beyond the simple mechanics of engineering problem solving? And it was not a triumphant design that never had problems. It was something more honest and more human than either of those simpler narratives. It was an aircraft built at the very edge of what 1939 aviation engineering understood, pushed into combat before every variable of its operation across the wildly different climates and altitudes of a global war could be fully tested and understood, and it very nearly failed because of that gap between ambition and readiness. The same men who had dreamed up its revolutionary twin boom design, its turbo superchargers, its tricycle gear, had to spend years in wind tunnels and test facilities and cold weather trials, tracing failures back to their root causes, redesigning intercooler cores, rebuilding turbo-regulator mechanisms, adding dive flaps, refining a machine under the enormous pressure of a war that could not wait for perfection. And the lesson embedded in this history is not that the Lightning was flawed and then fixed, but that essentially every advanced weapon system in history exists somewhere on that same journey, and the P-38's particular journey happened to take it from the frozen deadly skies over Germany, where it earned a reputation it did not entirely deserve, to the sun-scorched distances of the Pacific, where redesigned engines and cooling systems finally let it become the aircraft its designers had always envisioned, carrying men like Richard Bong and Thomas McGuire into the history books and delivering justice in its own violent way to the architect of Pearl Harbor over the waters near Bougainville. And when the war ended and historians began assessing which aircraft had mattered most, the P-38 Lightning story stood as a reminder that the difference between a legendary machine and a forgotten failure sometimes comes down not to grand strategy or heroic pilots alone, but to the quiet, unglamorous work of an engineer in Burbank, redesigning a few inches of aluminum tubing and a handful of regulator components, and in doing so, changing the outcome of a war fought half a world away in the burning skies over the Pacific.